So my name is Canel Guigante. I'm the Advocacy and Campaigns Officer at ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights on the topic of climate change, business, and human rights. And we at APHR are very pleased to have you all join us and to have such a wide range of members of parliament and senators joining us today, as well as their staff from across Southeast Asia. And I want to thank everyone for making the time to discuss this very critical issue. We're also very pleased to welcome non-APHR members who are joining us today. In case some of you joining us in this session are not familiar with APHR, APHR is a network of current and former parliamentarians who use their position to advance human rights and democracy in Southeast Asia. So our members use their mandate to advocate for human rights both inside and outside of parliaments, regionally and globally. And we work closely with civil society and do different activities such as conduct fact-finding missions, publish recommendations and opinions on some of the most important issues affecting the region. So following our session last week on the topic of protecting workers and boosting employment, today we are meeting for the last session of the series, which will focus on the role that parliamentarians can play in greening their economy and better tackling climate change in the economic recovery from COVID-19. So the COVID-19 crisis takes place in the midst of a wider critical crisis, which is the climate change crisis. And Southeast Asia, I'm sure all of you know, is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the impacts of climate change. Climate change, but also other environmental issues threaten the region's access to food, water, other natural resources, will also lead to an increase in poverty and conflict amongst many, many others. And it's important to note that deforestation and climate change are also key factors that have led to an increased number of epidemics around the world. So despite knowing what awaits the region in the near future, action across the region is severely lacking. Currently, our world is on track for a 3.2 Celsius degrees increase in its temperatures this century, instead of a 1.5 degrees target. This is a devastating scenario for Southeast Asia, and yet there has been a lot of underperformance in the region when it comes to climate action. And the decisions made today on recovery plans will be shaping our collective future and determining the economic trajectory the region takes. Therefore, at APHR, we believe it's crucial for the region's collective future that the measures adopted today to boost economies following the COVID-19 pandemic both do not come at the expense of solving the climate crisis, but most importantly, accelerate the region's transition to a sustainable economy that is not destructive of the environment. The pandemic has also revealed major existing inequalities and weaknesses in the region's governance system. Taken now to ensure that those affected by the epidemic will also not be made to bear the full burden of the lack of climate action again in the near future. So we are gathered today to discuss the role that members of parliament and senators from Southeast Asia, as well as their staff, can take to harness this historic opportunity to build back a stronger, greener, and more resilient economy. Like all our previous webinars in the series, this is a participatory webinar. And what we mean by participatory webinar is that it is a space for parliamentarians to really learn from each other and share their experiences through informal discussions, including discussing possibilities for collaboration across countries, but also enable speakers and participants to share informally and discuss critical information. So therefore, I really encourage everyone to take part in our discussions, to ask questions to our speakers and discuss with fellow parliamentarians. So now I will start by going through today's agenda, which is appearing on your screen. So first, we're very pleased to have Dr. Bill Hare, who is a senior economist and CEO of Climate Analytics, join us. So Dr. Bill Hare will present to members of parliament the different best practices and measures available for parliamentarians to adopt green stimulus measures in their economic recovery from COVID-19. We will then have the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Philippines, Honorable Lauren Legarda, who will speak about her own experience in greening the economic recovery of the Philippines and provide advice for fellow parliamentarians based on her very extensive experience in this topic. We will then have a short session for questions and answers, as well as clarification about the presentation and with the speakers, where our resource person, Mrs. Tiza Mafira, who is the Associate Director of the Climate Policy Initiative in Indonesia, will join the speakers in answering the questions that the participants may have. She will also give a short presentation in the second half of the session. After the Q&A, we will have a short anonymous poll on Mentimeter, and the aim of this poll is to understand participants' assessment of the sustainability of the region's economic recovery from COVID-19. So there will be a few questions, and we will give guidance on how to access the poll, which is very easy and user-friendly. All participants are invited to answer the poll. So after that, we will have our informal discussion, which is the main part of this webinar, between attendees, where we will discuss the next steps needed to achieve a greener economy that contributes to tackling climate change in Southeast Asia, and also discuss how APHR can support the attendees in achieving these next steps. So we can now start. So I would like to ask Dr. Bill Hare, who is Senior Scientist and CEO of Climate Analytics, to present on the measures that regional MPs can take to green and boost their economy in their recovery from COVID-19.
Thank you, Canel. And thank you for inviting me to present. I'll just get my PowerPoint here going to this group. It's an honor to be talking to you all. I'm going to be stepping through some of the scientific perspectives on where we stand now on climate change and policy, and what needs to be done, and what the issues are that have been identified that need attention in a general sense. I'm going to be, as far as possible, using Southeast Asian examples. So I should say at first, I'm from Climate Analytics, and also on this call, Deborah Ramalope, who's leader of the climate policy team, is on the call, along with Claire Stockwell, who leads the Climate Action Tracker, so is back up to assist in any questions that I'm not sure I can answer. So on the need for action, we all know the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 and in effect set the global goalposts for climate action, notably the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit goal to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And this goal provides a framing for a lot of the analysis I'm going to show you, and I think also needs to provide the framing for a lot of the action which governments and societies need to be thinking about, picking up and acting on. But we know that action towards this goal is seriously lagging. The Climate Action Tracker has been working since 2009 to calculate the total effects of all the actions, pledges and targets put forward by countries. And our most recent assessment from December 2019 indicates that current policies, all the policies of governments collectively around the world added up, put the world on about a 3 degree warming pathway. Others have made estimates close to this, but I think in round terms, 3 degrees is a good number to bear in mind. It's very far away from 1.5. All of the pledges and targets under the Paris Agreement only limit warming to about 2.8 degrees at best. So you can see already that the kind of action that's being planned, proposed under the Paris Agreement targets, the nationally determined contributions, is far away from where we need to get to with the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal. So that means that there needs to be a serious strengthening of Paris NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And as I will show towards the end, there's a need to do that in this year or early next year. Now, when the Paris Agreement was adopted, governments requested the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change look at the whole question of 1.5 degrees warming, its impacts, its responses, what can be done to get there. And it confirmed what we already knew, that the Paris Agreement NDCs were insufficient. And as a consequence, also agreed to update, countries agreed to update their NDCs this year. Time frame for that's been set back a bit because of the COVID crisis, and I'll come back to that towards the end. But it also showed that not only is 1.5 degrees still possible, but it showed the kind of action that countries need to undertake. And I'll step through some of those shortly. But if we stand back a bit and say, well, what's all this about? What are the big risks that we're facing? One of those risks from increased warming is damages to our economic development. So here's recent estimates that we've made for the ASEAN region, looking at the kind of economic losses that could occur, measured in reductions in GDP per capita below what would otherwise have occurred, but different levels of warming and different levels of policy. So if you look towards the right hand of this figure, around the 2100, 1.5 degree warming produces quite a significant reduction in per capita income. So it shows that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, ambitious and difficult as it is, will not actually prevent significant economic damage and losses. If we get on the 3 degree warming path, and stay on it as we are now, the NDC pathway, by 3 degrees warming, we basically double the damage. If we ask the question, what if big emitters made a 33% improvement in their NDCs? Well, it still wouldn't be sufficient to get us towards 1.5 degrees. It would reduce the damages a bit, but not eliminate. So that's one of the big issues out there, I think, for everyone to reflect on in terms of the urgency of action. As was mentioned, the Southeast Asian region is particularly vulnerable for a variety of different reasons to the manifold effects of global warming, whether it's flooding from rainfall, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's the effect of drought and heat. These are some examples from work that we've done in the past, and which others have done, which show a very small insight into the kind of physical risks which countries in the region will confront or are already confronting as the world warms. And the bottom line message to take away here is the rapid increase in risk as you go from a 1.5 to 3 degree world. The scientific community has shown over the last few years that there is really a significant difference, even only for 0.5 degree additional warming. This is a figure showing the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming for different regions, including Southeast Asia, for some risks on the left-hand side. And we know that 0.5 degree warming in Southeast Asia will increase the risks from climate change very significantly, 50 and in some cases 100% above the levels that one would see at 1.5 degrees. So that, I think, adds to the sense of scientific urgency. In terms of sustainable development, the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 had a very careful look at this, and really found that on the one hand, 1.5 degrees, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees has quite significant sustainable development benefits. And these benefits outweigh the trade-offs that come from having to act so quickly. The IPCC also emphasized the importance of redistributive policies and careful management by governments to resolve these trade-offs, and found that most of the trade-off issues can be dealt with by finding synergies between energy demand measures and renewable energy uptake across a whole lot of the SDGs. It's also very clear that the impacts of climate change are felt particularly by the poor, almost wherever you are. Lower income nations are most vulnerable because of their economic structure and low levels of economic resilience and adaptive capacity. The risks are higher for sectors where heat is poorly controlled, such as in agriculture, construction, or other work that require higher levels of physical exhaustion. This is an area where Southeast Asia is quite heavily exposed. Health costs are also greater for the poor due to a variety of issues, characteristic features also of the Southeast Asian region. Now, looking at where we stand, the Climate Action Tracker has been working, as I said, to try and work out what is going on globally and nationally. And we do about 35 countries at present, a bit over 85% of global emissions are covered by the Climate Action Tracker, including a number of countries in Southeast Asia. We don't, unfortunately, yet do the whole Southeast Asian group, but we'd love to do it, but resources are always an issue. But the top line message is that we know that most of the Paris NDCs are insufficient or worse. By worse, I mean highly insufficient or critically insufficient. And unfortunately, that's a picture that's remained fairly stable. But on the other hand, we do see some progress in climate policy. It is becoming visible in some countries. So here we've tried to look at, well, are countries progressing in improving what they're doing? Are they progressing and improving towards the long-term targets they need to have? Are their current policies working? And you see there are some countries that are making some progress. Here I've marked the Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia. Vietnam is not included on this list, but I'll come to that shortly. You see they cover across different categories of progress. Philippines is 2-degree compatible, making minor progress. Singapore remains highly insufficient. Indonesia has made little progress, for example. Happy to discuss those at question time, of course, so everyone can have a different view about that. The Philippines, we do in the Climate Action Tracker. At present, it's got a 2-degree compatible rating, not quite 1.5. But what's at risk there if the Philippines continues coal expansion, this would create a situation where it moved outside of the 2-degree compatible zone and had a lot of lock-in of coal-fired capacity that would be way beyond what would be tolerable under the Paris Agreement. Indonesia, its policies are quite ranked by the Climate Action Tracker as highly insufficient. This is a view from the Climate Action Tracker's webpage for Indonesia. It shows that its current policies in blue are heading upwards in terms of emissions over the next decade and moving away from anything that might be considered satisfactory. Singapore, also rated as highly insufficient. Its emissions are beginning to plateau, hopefully, but they're not going down as that country would need to do. Vietnam, which is a new addition to the Climate Action Tracker, has some positive signals. Its rating of its Paris NDC is critically insufficient. Targets will meet that critically insufficient level, but it's also showing signs of investing in renewable energy. It could become a leader in the region, particularly if it drops a lot of its coal expansion plans and updates its NDC in a positive direction. Now, asking the question, how to strengthen action? This figure is from a study that we completed last year for UNEP in Bangkok, Decarbonising Asia. Here's a figure on the left showing for the group of ASEAN member states where emissions would need to go, heading towards zero emissions by around 2050, showing in broad terms what the sectors need to do. You see the power sectors, the sector that reduces emissions fastest, industry reduces slowly, transport faster. And these analyses are backed by modelling which shows that these reductions are technically and economically feasible and have sustainable development benefits. What's critical to understand for policymakers is the importance of the power sector. Decarbonising the power sector is really important for the Paris Agreement pathways, because when you have a zero carbon power sector, you have zero carbon electricity, which then enables decarbonisation of many other sectors, including transport, industry, housing, and commerce. So that's why the decarbonisation of the power sector is so important. In round terms, what the modelling shows in general is that the sector as a whole in Southeast Asia, the power sector needs to be decarbonised by about 50% by 2030 and more or less fully decarbonised by 2050. Very ambitious, but the decreasing cost of renewable energy sources provides a major opportunity. This figure shows the trend of renewable energy costs in the region over the period from 2012 until quite recently. And what is really important to see here is that the cost of renewable energy from these two broad sources, solar photovoltaics and wind, is now below or close to the bottom of the range for new fossil fuel power plant. So what that means is that there is very little reason not to build renewables instead of fossil fuels. And in fact, it could be more costly to choose fossil fuel power sources rather than build renewables. But in the ASEAN region, there are quite a lot of barriers that need to be looked at, including development of more enabling policies, reducing capital costs, and reducing a range of other kinds of costs to take advantage of what is a very radical reduction in the cost of renewable energy. What is critical to getting onto the 1.5 degree pathway is a need to phase out coal. Whilst you see many different results for other technologies from the economic and energy modelling, for coal it's really clear that it's the single most important step to keep the door open for achieving the Paris Agreement, that this technology is phased out by the 2040s. What is happening in the real world in the last year is, for the first time, we've seen global coal generation capacity fall in 2020. But we also see that Southeast Asia remains a hotspot for planned coal development. It has about 14% of the coal pipeline, the planned coal capacity globally as of mid this year. Now, the phase out of coal and reduction of fossil fuel use comes with a lot of sustainable development co-benefits. In other words, there's co-benefits from transforming the energy system towards zero carbon. These are figures drawn from the Decarbonising Asia report I mentioned earlier, which show projected coal-related mortality in Southeast Asia between 2011 and 2030. The numbers may vary according to the methodology, but the overall conclusions, I think, are quite strong, that increasing coal use will cause an increasing loss of life and livelihoods as a consequence of coal pollution in Southeast Asia that is really substantial. So it illustrates one of the benefits, the co-benefits of phasing out this technology. For some countries in the region, fossil fuel imports represent a large dependency for many countries. For others, of course, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, fossil fuels are a big export earner. But for many who are importing fuels, fossil fuel imports represent a large cost to the national economy. An example here is Philippines. Fuel imports account for about 20% of national imports in recent years. So that's something to also consider as a co-benefit of the zero carbon transition. I can't go through all of the examples for Southeast Asia of potential for reductions, but here's one. It's from the work which the Climate Action Tracker Consortium have done, which is New Climate, Ecofis as it was then, and ourselves, Climate Analytics, last year, where we looked at the kind of opportunities for Indonesia to get away from its current development scenario, where you see emissions increasing strongly in the power sector indefinitely, really through 2050, and the kind of pathway that could develop through a heavy investment in renewables and advanced electric technology. The bottom left-hand figure shows a step of different kinds of measures, a waterfall graph which shows how you can reduce from where emissions are headed for 2030 to get to levels consistent with the Paris Agreement by dealing with electricity supply, introducing efficient technology and electric vehicles into passenger and road transport and so on. So the potential benefits of a green recovery, coming now to the COVID issue. The scientific community has really had a good look at this. I'm just going to show you some of the results of the Climate Action Tracker, but others have published very similar work. We know that global CO2 emissions will fall in 2020 due to the economic damages and lockdown measures of COVID-19. We also understand that many of the economic impacts of COVID-19 will do little to bend the long-term emission curves. We've come to that conclusion by looking at a range of different response measures. We've also looked at what strategies to invest in green energy infrastructure, not just in the electricity area, but energy efficiency, different energy supply technologies, electrification of transport, better city transport systems and so on can do. And this is a graph of our main conclusions. On the left, you see our pre-COVID-19 pandemic assessment of where emissions were headed from December 2019. And you see that the pre-COVID-19 current policies were heading us towards 55 billion tonnes of carbon a year by 2030. Paris targets will get a bit lower, far away from the yellow and green curves, the 1.5 and 2 degree consistent curves. On the right-hand side, we show the results of looking at what a range of post-COVID-19 current policies could do. On the negative, if there was a rebound to fossil fuels by governments investing in so-called shovel-ready fossil fuel investments or decreasing green investment, you could even see a rebound to higher levels than what we would otherwise have seen, despite the COVID economic damages. On the other hand, if we looked at a range of green stimuli, weak, moderate, and strong, representing a shift in investment towards green investment and a decrease in fossil fuel investments, and the weak, moderate, and strong green stimulus graph on the right shows and gives you the numbers by which we've calculated those increases in green investment. Investments that would have often otherwise had to occur, but being switched towards green investments rather than investments that are fossil fuel dominated. What's very interesting is that a weak and moderate green stimulus can get you into a 2 degree pathway, the world as a whole. Strong green stimulus would get you into a 1.5 degree Paris Agreement compatible pathway. So this shows what's at stake in a way in terms of the character of government stimulus packages. And there are already some good examples, such as the European Union's green stimulus. There are some negative examples. I can refer to the plans of the Australian government to subsidise natural gas, for example. We also know that stimulus packages can bend the temperature curve a bit. This is work published just last week in Nature Climate Change by scientists in the UK and several of our colleagues at Climate Analytics, looking at the overall effect of the COVID-19 responses, showing that ultimately, if you look at the right-hand figure, the moderate and strong green stimulus can bend the curve sufficiently to, on the strong side, limit warming to 1.5 degrees. On the moderate side, closer to 1.6, 1.7 degrees. So really can have a very big effect on where the planet is headed if we get the stimulus packages right. We also had a look at, from the Climate Action Tracker, what should be on a government and policymakers do and don't list. Things you should do and things you probably should not do in most cases. And here's a checklist graph of this, showing on energy supply, direct support for zero emission technologies, reform of fossil fuel subsidies where it's possible, on land-based transport, bring in incentives for zero emission vehicles, industry, support the uptake of efficient appliances, support industry moving towards low or zero carbon technologies, building, support efficient buildings, retrofits and so on, land use and environmental protection, support landscape restoration, reforestation, avoid deforestation. So I think this is a checklist which we've found many policymakers have thought quite useful, but I'm interested to hear what additional ideas that you would have from the ASEAN region that we can supplement this with. Now, we've asked the question also, what is going on out there as countries reflect on the need to update their NDCs? There are, as a very mixed picture at present. Most countries have not updated their Paris NDCs yet. A few have, and 7 have said they will not update their NDCs. Let's just step a bit more through what is going on. A really interesting example is Chile, which has updated its NDC in a very positive way. The NDC moves from highly insufficient to insufficient for its unconditional target. And what is, I think, even more interesting is that its conditional target if it achieved, if it obtained resources internationally, would take it into a Paris Agreement compatible mode. And what is really interesting to know about Chile is that they have a coal phase-out plan, and that industry and the mining industry in Chile, for example.
Sorry, Dr. Bilher, you just have 1 minute left.
Okay, nearly done. And then looking at ASEAN, we have so far little sign of countries proposing, NDCs yet. Singapore has proposed no NDC update yet, and the Indonesian government is still reflecting, and we have little information as to what other countries in the region are doing. Be very interested to learn what is going on. So that's the end of my presentation. Probably made it with 10 seconds to spare. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and very detailed information. This is very, very helpful for us. And I wanted to thank you especially for detailing information on the NDCs. As you mentioned, many countries in the region still have a long way to go to take sufficient action on climate change in their NDCs that is compatible with the Paris Agreement and a safe world. So to respond to this, I wanted to flag that APHR has prepared a short briefer specifically for members of parliament in Southeast Asia on the actions that they can take to ensure their governments update their NDCs. So we encourage you all and all the participants to read this briefer, as it contains some very extremely useful information about climate change action for parliamentarians. And you can find the link to the briefer in this chat. So thank you very much again for your presentation. And we will now have the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Philippines, Honorable Lauren Legarda, who will present on her very extensive experience and advice on greening the regional economy in the recovery from COVID-19. So thank you for joining us. You have the floor. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Yes, warm ecological greetings to my fellow parliamentarians and climate advocates. I'm honored to be with you today to talk about my lifelong work on environment, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. Having authored numerous laws on environment pre-pandemic, I think that goes way back in 1998 when I was a first-term senator, and it enumerated on the art card the ecological laws of the Philippines. My experience has taught me that implementation and enforcement and financing the laws always need a push and a shove. I mightily gave that push and shove when I became the chairman of the Finance Committee of the Philippine Senate several years ago, where we discussed the budgets of all government agencies that are mandated to implement the various laws on screen, whether it would be solid waste, or clean water, or the air we breathe, or even wildlife conservation, or the transitioning from fossil fuel to renewable energy, or even mainstreaming education with climate and environmental issues. So during that stint, in the past several years as chairman of the Finance Committee, I introduced innovations in the national budget to mainstream climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, through special provisions on adaptation measures and by climate tagging specific provisions of the appropriations law. The extent to which budgets can be scrutinized then and now is critical to a transition to a better normal. As we move into a new phase in human history, I am even more focused on getting them implemented well and ensuring a future for the next generation in these uncertain times. On one hand, I believe the pandemic gave nature a pause, a short breather when most of the world stayed home. It's unfortunate, but it happened. There was a slight bounce back of the natural world. It was not as if such a pandemic was beyond imagination. Despite the clear possibility of such a situation brought about by the illegal wildlife trade And incidentally, I delivered a privileged speech on this as early as, I think it was end of January or in February, when the virus had not yet reached the Philippines, for just 1 or 2 people who had since left the country, but were tourists. And so not many people understood the connection of biodiversity and the illegal wildlife trade and the pandemic, which was then in China and not yet in Europe, not yet in the US, not even in the Philippines yet. So our hopes on the disappearance of these threats, saying that even if a vaccine is found, controlling the virus will require a massive effort. Other experts are certain we will not be able to eradicate this at all. The same as most viruses, with the sole exception of smallpox, and that our best hope would be the lessening of the severity of its impacts. It is therefore an ideal opportunity to take stock of the direction we've taken in human history and reassess the impact our economies have had on the life-giving capacity of our planet. It is in this context that I intervened locally, nationally, and eventually globally. Locally, the immediate need was to ensure a stable supply of nutritious food during quarantine, and that was March, April, and May for the Philippines. Of course, parliamentarians are responsible for passing budgets so naturally that that is our avenue of intervention. The local executives, however, were overwhelmed by the sheer extent of the problem and had to mobilize response while still preventing the spread of the virus. I'm no longer in the Senate, and I'm a representative of a district where the people are vulnerable because it is a province such as both mountains and seas with indigenous people as well, most of whom are farmers and fisher folks. And so you might wonder why, as a lawmaker, I would have to deal with the foods that you see from farmers, because it is expected of lawmakers even to deal with local issues as food. In our case, my office partnered with the provincial government of Antique, which is the province where I belong, in providing access to national government funds and available resources for use in pandemic response. Since the main markets of our agricultural province are Boracay Island in the next province of Aklan and Iloilo City in the next province of Iloilo, much of the crop inventories were suddenly without buyers when no tourists were arriving. Thankfully, the closure of Boracay previously gave us a dry run for the pandemic. We immediately launched a program called Food for All, or in a local language, Pagkaon para sa Tanan, that brought up, or where we purchased what farmers could not sell at prices they could accept. The produce were distributed for free to the families needing food relief. It quickly became evident that without the usual tourism and fully functional markets, we needed to highlight the primacy of local needs. The project taught us the importance of crop diversity, a more direct connection to the market, and strategies to encourage the planting of other food crops that may be produced in smaller quantities. My staff, majority of whom are women, played a big role in determining the most effective means of putting food on the tables, so to speak, of our constituents. We're also studying how to further green the supply chain in this way, diversifying from a lot of watermelons and turnips to more nutrient-rich crops for the family. Diverse ecosystems and farms should lead to diverse economies to be able to overcome the challenge of the times better. Legislation that supports these efforts provides budgets and incentives for them and discourages sustainable or unsustainable businesses are key to a post-COVID transition. On the budget front, we also had to look for other sources to alleviate the economic downturn. Some legal restrictions on the use of budgets coming from the extractive industry needed to be relaxed. The current law provides that a percentage of proceeds from taxes on coal mining shall be allocated for the use of local governments. However, the law restricts 80% of this use to lowering the cost of electricity in these areas. Local governments have had a difficult time spending this share in the national wealth, considering that there is only so much lowering you can do with regard to the cost of electricity. As such, I filed House Bill 7035 to allow these funds to also be used for COVID response. In the longer term, a changing climate would require major revisions in our very archaic laws on coal mining and coal-based power generation. And I do encourage everyone in Parliament all over the world to imagine a post-coal scenario sooner rather than later. Until then, the funds it generates must be used in the most efficient way possible to address the current public health emergency. It also became clear that we needed to communicate to the public to encourage and support the needed lifestyle changes more suited for both pandemic response as well as climate change. I was a young broadcast journalist 30 years ago, before I was first elected to the Philippine Senate at the age of 38. So this was a natural way for me to help the transition. I started a Zoom, Facebook Live series called Stories for a Better Normal, Pandemic and Climate Pathways, in collaboration with the Climate Change Commission, which was the output of the Climate Change Act, which I authored when I was senator, the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, and the Mother Earth Foundation, an NGO. We just finished our 13th episode and have featured not just coping mechanisms, but exciting opportunities to prevail and overcome the coming crisis. I did not want to focus just on COVID response, but I wanted it to sync it along with climate adaptation and mitigation. We've had inspiring stories of permaculture, farming among the youth, even seed saving and sharing, culinary heritage, active transport, sustainable mobility, youth activism for climate, and even backyard bird watching. Not only were we able to reach a wider audience, but this affords us a chance to speak directly to policymakers in an informal setting to find the barriers and obstacles they meet in the path to sustainability and pursue the needed responses. We then follow through with letters, resolutions, bills that support the ideas from this weekly episodes. The response to this series has been overwhelming, not only from audiences, but also policymakers. In the Philippine House of Representatives, I was appointed as chairperson of the New Normal Subcommittee, and I was tasked to sponsor the Better Normal Bill, which seeks to establish public health and environmental standards and safeguards for the better normal in the workplace, public spaces, and communities. The bill was approved by the House on third reading last week. I look forward to working with the Senate, to which I belonged for 3 terms, to determine the best possible legislative responses to sustainable mobility, industry-specific recovery, and behavioral norms. I also urge the members of parliament who have joined us this afternoon from across the region to craft legislation that will allow economies to adapt to a better norm through public investments in green infrastructure, tax holidays for the hardest hit sustainable industries, longer pay periods, and reductions in penalties for dues to government. As principal author of the expanded National Integrated Protected Areas Law when I was still senator, that established 94 new protected areas all over the Philippines, I needed to do something to ensure that our prized natural gems, our Noah's Arks, will not be sacrificed in the search for quick fix or quick solutions. Since the pandemic made these sites inaccessible to ecotourism, revenues have dropped, and pressure to make livelihoods out of these public resources are expected to be high due to massive unemployment. So we launched, along with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, a monthly webinar that will take us to these protected areas virtually. Our audience is taken to these sites through photos and videos and interviews presented by the frontliners in these sites. The resulting cross-fertilization of ideas and strategies are increasing frontliner capacity and inspiration. Finally, massive unemployment is expected to drive people to seek livelihoods in remaining wild areas. I filed a bill to create an environmental enforcement bureau. Both arrest and prosecution for these crimes require a set of skills, equipment, and facilities that normal crime fighting agencies don't have. So I assisted the House Committee on Economic Affairs in arranging for discussions with resource economists to address the values and services provided by nature in setting directions and apportioning budgets and resources. These discussions were brought about by the release of this year.
For the interruption, you have 2 minutes left. Sorry about this.
By the release this year of review by Partha Dasgupta, commissioned by the UK Treasury on how to go about including these considerations in financial and economic planning. The review clearly stated that if natural capital were treated as assets, then we must see the loss of biodiversity as an asset portfolio management problem. For too long, the genetic library, the fertile soils, the nutrient cycles, natural flood control, and pollutant filter mechanisms, pollination by insects, and natural carbon sequestration were not given a recognizable worth and therefore treated as free and expendable. This blindness to the values they bring has caused a degradation of these resources. More than at any other time in global history, this pandemic has afforded a huge opportunity to rearrange our economic priorities to consider nature and our services. My staff met with economists and biologists to determine the best ways to value and account for ecological services so that national accounting will no longer be nature blind. Based on these new learnings brought about by the pandemic, I also updated our Philippine Economic, Environmental, and Natural Resources Accounting or PINRA bill for refiling. More than any other policy change, an integral consideration of the wealth nature brings should be pursued for all economic planning and assessment to prevent further ecological calamity. This cannot be done merely as a sector of development or as an isolated area of planning. The consideration of nature services would have to be integrated in all aspects of country development plans and lawmaking. On the global front is our fight for climate justice. It is about holding accountable the countries that have caused this global climate crisis and urging them to take a stronger lead in climate action. We continue to wait for them to deliver in full their commitments for finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, and to make drastic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions within the short window of time of under 10 years before most of the adverse impacts become irreversible. The Paris Agreement on climate change is a common goal, but it implores the developed countries to do more by significantly reducing their emissions now and providing assistance to build the resilience of vulnerable countries like ours. As Commissioner of the Global Commission on Adaptation and the Climate Vulnerable Forum Ambassador for Parliaments, the UNFCCC Adaptation Champion, and ISDR Global Champion for Resilience, my message never veered away from the aspirations and goals of the Paris Agreement, a global call for sustainability and low carbon development made more pronounced now than we are in a pandemic. We've never had a bigger opportunity to reassess our development paradigms than now. While we have succeeded in passing laws that protect the environment, it remained to be seen as a mere segment of governance. We are now awakening to the reality that the life-giving services that nature offers are the most critical assets that we have as we face our future. The human rights to life, food, health, long considered economic, social, and cultural rights are deeply tied into the right to a healthy environment that provides all these. It is therefore incumbent upon us legislators in this forum and parliamentarians to make sure that the needs and opportunities of mankind are in perfect harmony with the preservation and conservation of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Deputy Speaker, and thank you for accepting to share your very extensive experience. We move on to the discussion. We have Mrs. Tita Mafira from the Climate Policy Initiative in Indonesia, who will speak in a short presentation and give some of her own advice as part of this think tank on different ways that the parliamentarians and participants can address this issue and promote a green economic recovery from the crisis. So please do go ahead, Mrs. Mafira, and thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you, Kanal, and thank you for having me. It's good to be here with honorable members of the parliament. So I mentioned I lead a Climate Policy Initiative Indonesia. We are a think tank that with 6 offices around the world. We focus on tracking, analyzing, and mobilizing finance for climate action. And I prepared a presentation. Let me just bring it up here. Okay, so promoting a green economic recovery for Southeast Asian resilience. And resilience here is something that I really need to highlight, because resilience denotes that we are resilient to changes that we cannot imagine at the moment. The COVID crisis is something that we have not really thought would happen, not really predicted would happen for most of us. And this is probably not the last crisis that we will be dealing with. And so we need to make sure that our economic stability is based on pillars that are resilient to shocks, resilient to changes that are both predictable and not predictable. I'd just like to quote the UN Secretary General in his speech when he launched a policy paper specifically for Southeast Asia recovery, where he highlighted that 4 areas will be critical in the recovery plans. First, tackling inequality. Second, bridging the digital divide. Third, greening the economy. Fourth, upholding human rights. So greening the economy is right there and is described as creating jobs of the future and to decarbonize economies still too dependent on coal and other industries of the past. And it really seems as it's really apparent that the Southeast Asian economy has contracted, is in a recession at the moment, severely impacted by the COVID crisis. All these dips that you see are current GDP compared to what was the projection of pre-COVID. So all of us have experienced a recession, although the projections are that the recession won't last more than a year, because the projections for 2021 is that we'll be back on track for GDP growth, which signals really that the market is still hopeful that a vaccine will be widely accessible by 2021. So it's really sort of people looking at this as a relatively short-term 1-year crisis. Now, we have another crisis apart from the health crisis, and that is the climate crisis. And the projections are that the health crisis could be dwarfed by the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is not going to be a short-term crisis. It's going to be a long-term, and we're already experiencing this crisis. Now, the impact to Southeast Asia's GDP is quite significant. In fact, Southeast Asia's GDP is projected to be the worst impacted by climate change by 2060. And the reasons for that is mostly due to agriculture. Here you see the huge green bar. That's mostly agriculture, because the Southeast Asian economies are very reliant on agriculture, and climate change, severe droughts or severe flooding could decimate agricultural sector, as well as sea level rise. So the key to building a resilient economy is to decarbonize. So I'm quoting the UN Secretary General. It's to decarbonize and create jobs of the future. And the way that we do that is that, number one, fiscal stimulus packages. This is the momentum for fiscal stimulus packages, and they should accelerate green industries. Number two, economic growth should not depend on resource depletion. And number three, essential needs must be diversified and decentralized. And I'll explain all three of these in my next slides. So first of all, fiscal stimulus packages should accelerate green industries, but unfortunately, most fiscal packages, as was evident from the polling that we did just now, have not specifically targeted greening the sectors of energy, agriculture, industry, transport, or waste. This is a recent research conducted by Vivid Economics. It looks at G20 countries. So on the second bar from the left, you see Indonesia, and there's a huge red line there where Indonesia is, which means that Indonesia's fiscal stimulus actually has a negative contribution to the green economy. And the reason for that is on the table on the right, you see where there's an opportunity for agricultural sectors to be green, energy sectors to be green, industries, transport, waste to be green. There's an opportunity to pile funding, fiscal stimulus into green industries, but what Indonesia did, and I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries did, is instead they piled it onto the business as usual sectors, therefore exacerbating, business as usual. This is going to be where we're actually currently going to start working with Vivid Economics to update this data to include more Asian and Southeast Asian countries. Southeast Asian countries still provide fossil fuel subsidies. This is one glaring example of how we're exacerbating business as usual. In Indonesia's case, the subsidies actually outweigh the COVID stimulus. So that's unfortunate. A few months ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, the Indonesian government passed a revised mining law that gives an extension to existing coal companies. Whereas they were supposed to expire within 5 years, they're now going to be extended for another 20 to 30 years. And that's part of the reason why we think, well, sustainability wasn't part of the economic recovery plans at all. Second, economic growth should be decoupled from resource use. So the less fossil fuels that are extracted and utilized, the less economic dependence on concentrated and price volatile energy supply chains. This is something that Bill Hare was also explaining. A lot of the things that I'm going to be explaining in my slides will sound familiar because you've just heard it from Bill Hare, but that's good because these things cannot be emphasized enough. You look at the fossil fuel price index, you can see the volatilities in price. There was a spike near 2008 where there was also a recession, and then there was another spike and then a downfall. Now, coal has shown the greatest volatility, rising 4 times the 2000 price in 2008 and nearly the same, nearly 3.5 times in 2011. Oil has similarly shown volatility, varying by 2 to 3-fold over this period. At the moment, oil's price has dipped significantly, and that's not necessarily a good thing either. For oil importing countries such as Indonesia and most of Southeast Asia, that will create a backlog of oil supply. It will also turn away investors seeking to invest in oil, and it disrupts the development plans that have already been made. So if we compare fossil fuel prices to renewable energy prices are showing a much more stable trend and actually a downward trend. And the prices at the moment are competitive against electricity production costs in most of Southeast Asia. And so the colorful lines at the top are the levelized costs of electricity in Southeast Asian countries. And the purple line at the bottom, that's the renewable energy cost, which will make renewable energy competitive. But you have to remember that this is just cost. There's a lot of factors that determine whether renewable energy will become the dominant energy in a country or not. At the moment, fossil fuels are still subsidized, and that makes entrance of renewable energy very difficult because they may find it difficult to get, commercial loans from banks to invest in the country. They might find it difficult to find buyers and purchasers. If the electricity company, usually state-owned electricity company, is not going to buy that renewable energy because of certain policies that are skewed towards favoring fossil fuels. So we need to take advantage of these competitive prices, and we need to be proactive in taking advantage of them. Third, essential needs must be diversified and decentralized. And I say essential needs because whenever we say, decentralization, there's a lot of pushback that what we're actually talking about is that we're being anti-globalization. And I'm sure many parliament members have experienced this as well. This is not talking about being against globalization. I mean, global trade is here to stay, I think. But there are certain essential needs that need to remain closer to home. And I think we've discovered that the hard way. And in the beginning of the pandemic, when we were scrambling to get masks and health equipment from overseas. So energy, food, mobility, and health services, those are at least 4 essential needs that have been identified. And these are easily disrupted when they're dependent on a centralized supply source. At the moment, the energy mix in Southeast Asia remains heavily dominated by fossil fuels. Some of them from homegrown, like coal, some of them imported, like oil. Agriculture as well is focused heavily on single commodity crops. In Indonesia and Malaysia, that would be palm oil. And this is actually edging out other crops. So in the past, where a district would have rice, corn, as well as other things, now all that has declined and only palm oil now dominates. So that's going to be a problem if they face a drought, right? Where are they going to get food? So in Indonesia, 88 districts, up to 7 million people are already food insecure. Transportation remains heavily dominated by fuel-powered cars. Health services in remote islands, particularly in Indonesia, rely on costly electricity powered by dirty diesel. And public finance, so finance coming from within countries, state budgets, currently drives fossil fuel entrenchment. So this is a graph from Southeast Asia Energy Outlook, where it shows that public funds invested into coal and gas power are massive, this blue line on the very top. And you see that the private financing matches it, whereas the second bar, hydropower and geothermal, is much less. And the third bar, utility scale of solar PV and wind, is even lesser. Now, interesting here is you see the private financing kind of matching how much public finance is going in to these sectors. And that's because private investors look to the government for investment signals. If the government is investing heavily into that sector, that's where the private sector will follow. If the government is not investing heavily in that sector, then the private sector will also be less likely to invest in those sectors. And that's where we call it public finance should be able to leverage private finance so that we can fund the huge amount of climate action that's needed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Here's my last slide. So the region needs more public and private finance deployed to ensure resilience, economic resilience in the face of climate crisis. And if we look at the Asian region here, here's South Asia, East Asia, and Pacific, there's 2 dots here, two circles. with equal red and blue. Now, the red signifies public finance and the blue signifies private finance. What we should be seeing is more blue, actually, because the private sector has more money, right? What this means is that maybe the public finance isn't deployed as effectively as it should. Maybe it should be deployed more effectively to attract private investment instead of just, kind of being put to sectors that won't be able to replicate or scale those climate actions. So yeah, that's my presentation on resilience, and happy to discuss more. Thank you
for participating in this series again. It's been, I really hope that everyone has learned a lot from the series and that this is helpful to exercising your mandate or your work in Parliament. So thank you very much also to our speakers for their presentations and for the participants for joining us. And we look forward to you joining us again in our future activities at APHR. So thank you very much everyone for joining.